longer, lower, slacker.
These are the buzzwords used by seemingly the entire mountain bike industry when it comes to referring to modern mountain bike geometry. And there's certainly no shortage of options when it comes to picking longer bikes. But the thing is, are they the best option for you? And after all, some of the world's fastest enduro racers are starting to choose smaller frame sizes in order to gain manoeuvrability. And what we're starting to hear at trail centres is that smaller bikes are just a bit more fun. And you know what? Maybe they're onto something. Maybe the smaller bike is that bit more fun than the longer bike. Let's see how it works, shall we? For today's video, I've chosen to ride an Ooyy rail. This one's a size large, belongs to Rich on GMBN, who's around 6 foot tall. This one is a size extra large, and this is my bike, and I'm about 6'3". So I'm firmly in the XL sizing, if you were to look at a geometry chart. And Rich actually is kind of comfortable on the large, but is actually on the edge. He could go as far as riding the XL there. We'll get into the geometry on the bikes in a second, but let's talk a little bit about how we got this far with the long bikes to start with. So pre-2012, an aggressive mountain bike with 150 to 160mm travel, you'd probably expect to see it having a head angle of around 67 degrees, which sounds really, really steep. If you consider we're on like 64, it's fairly common these days. And you'd also expect to see a seat angle of around 71 versus 77, up to 79 on some bikes you're seeing today. And then, of course, there's the stem length and the overall length of the bikes. Now, back in those days, you didn't actually tend to measure the reach measurement of a bike. You'd actually look at the top tube length on them. And given the fact that the bikes had a steeper head angle, you could get quite a long top tube, so the bike could feel great when you sat down. But as soon as you stood up, the bike felt dramatically shorter. And given the fact it had much longer stems, you typically expected to see a 70 or 80mm stem on a bike of that travel in that era. You could just feel that things were just not great. And then in 2012, the Spanish brand Mondraker was working with World Cup racer Fabian Borel. And they started to look at what was successful on downhill bikes, which had longer front ends, and they applied it to trail and enduro bikes. So it's really quite a cool concept. If you consider the bikes of the time with 150 to 160mm travel tended to have stem lengths of 70 to 80mm, and what they did was reduce the stem length back to 10mm and put that 60mm on the front centre of the bike. So that's the measurement from your bottom bracket axle to the front wheel axle. So the handlebars remained in the same position, front wheel way further out, and that gave two significant advantages. When climbing, the extra weight on that front wheel gave you better performance, essentially. The front wheel didn't wander around, had more weight on there, so you wouldn't be doing wheelies on the really steep stuff. And then when descending, front wheel way further out in front of you gave you loads more confidence, loads more security on that front wheel, and then add to the fact a longer wheelbase bike, generally speaking, is more stable when you're going fast and through the rough stuff. Really dramatically changed everything. Now, if you want to learn a bit more about that concept, I've got one of those bikes myself. Have a look at a video that's just down there floating around. It explains the story a bit more. But really, it was thanks to them taking a plunge and doing that all in one go rather than incrementally doing it that really did help shape where we are today with bikes like these. Okay, so a bit about these two bikes here. As explained, one here is a size large, this one's a size extra large. They're both set up with 29-inch wheels, front and rear, both set up with coil shocks and air forks of the same length and travel. They've both got the low BB height, so I'm trying to keep everything as same as possible. So the seat angle on both the bikes is 77 degrees, head angle is 64 degrees on both of them. Top tube on the shorter one is 626mm. Top tube on my bike is 653mm. And then, excuse my touchscreen nose there, the reach on the two bikes, which is the more crucial of the two, 485 and 510. And just to illustrate this between the two, I've kind of tried to set them up to be fairly similar. So my saddle's in a more regular position on here, and on a bike that fits me correctly with the right width bars and right length stem, I look for about 21.5 inches from tip of the saddle to centre of the bar. And this one here is, yeah, completely bang on, so 550 basically, so that's like bang on where I like to be. And Rich's one with the saddle all the way back to try and get the climbing position, 540, so 21.25 there. So fairly similar, a little bit shorter in the saddle. Mine's got an 800mm bar. This one has got a 780 bar on here. So it is a little bit different, and that will also make a difference. The other one that I like to look at is bottom bracket axle to the end of the bars, because that gives me an indication of how I feel. Now obviously bar width will change your position as well. So 780 bars, just under 930, so 36.5 inches basically there. Now this one, obviously it's a much bigger bike and it has the bigger bar, 965, so 38 inches, bang on. So this one, when out the saddle, is substantially bigger, like an inch bigger. Yeah, that does make a huge difference. But in the saddle, not a million miles apart. Let's see what they're like on the trail, shall we? Oh my God, feels so much better. And already there's so many differences between them. So my entire mountain biking life, I've pretty much been riding bikes that are too small. It's only been in the last decade really that things have changed. I mean, I know it's a long period of time, but I've been doing this a long time. Now, although there's only really probably half an inch difference between the two bikes, generalising here, when climbing seated, don't feel too much difference. The shorter wheelbase is definitely noticeable. It does feel a little bit more responsive. Like on tighter twisty turns, I've definitely got a pre-turn. I've got to pull out, kind of like driving a long wheelbase van versus a car. You've just got to consider your turning angle a little bit more. It's never been a problem really until I've ridden that against it and I've gone back to it. And then you really notice how much you have to compensate. And the same for uphill or downhill switchbacks. Again, it's not a problem, but you really have to carve out wide to make the turn. On the shorter bike, you just don't have to do that. And I can totally see why some of the enduro races, for I'm guessing those exact reasons, are favouring them. They're probably good enough when it comes to the fast, the rough, the jumps, that they don't need to consider the fact that a smaller bike is less stable. I tried to ride that through some jumps just up there, and I literally couldn't ride it. And it's not like it's an unrideable bike. I'm running that with slightly more sag than I am on this, just because it was Rich's setup really. And I'm sitting deeper in the travel, but the thing that really happens with the bike that's shorter, your weight shift affects the suspension much, much more. On this, I feel like I can push into it like anything at any time. I'm directly neutral on the bike. I feel much more comfortable on it. I can definitely see the positives with a shorter sized bike, but just the sheer difference in what your weight does on the bike, like that is huge for me, absolutely massive. Just a quick thing on switchbacks. So almost everywhere, this is harder work through the tight stuff. But I've just ridden these ridiculously tight switchbacks and I probably rode it similar speed on both bikes, but it felt much easier on this. And the theory is that on Rich's bike, I'm moving my weight around so much forwards and backwards the whole time, you're having to muscle the bike around a bit more. And this, you just think about your lines. It just feels a bit more intuitive on the longer bike, which is not what I thought was gonna happen. I got it whistled through stuff. You can move the front end around. Oh wow, that's mega tight. I would struggle on my bike through there. I kind of got to wheelie the front end round some of them just to get through. Just like that. Oh man, I tell you what, there is such a big difference. And actually riding through this bit of terrain, granted it's not uphill or downhill, but it's fairly typical, like just a windy, twisty section of woods. it's quite tiring on this to get through kind of clean, because every time you've got to preempt how sharp the turn's going to be. Quite often I'm sort of wheeling the front end around. On Rich's bike, it's just so you can thread it through, no probs. And I guess actually it kind of underlines why cross-country bikes, although they have got longer, they're never going to get as long as enduro bikes, because you have to be able to ride this sort of terrain really quick. But yeah, if you're riding mixed terrain, the short bike's definitely way more agile. This is actually quite hard work for you here. Although it's not that easy to climb anything, a nice long bike with modern geometry definitely positions you well. Now this just reminds me of the old days. You know me, I love my nostalgia, but forearm pain when climbing, that's wrong. Oh, definitely got to perch on the front of that seat to keep that front end down. So, fire roads, fairly conventional stuff. Really, there's not much in it between them. Got the saddle position, so my cockpit feels fairly similar between the two. But here's the problem. On steep climbs, the regular bike, or the bike that fits me correctly, just will pedal away, no problem. I'm wasting energy trying to keep the front end down. You feel it in your arms, you're tensing your arms to try and load the front of the bike. And that's because I've got the saddle so far back to make the bike fit me here. My weight's way too far over the rear wheel axle. So regardless of the fact that this has got a steep seat angle and it's quite a long bike, I'm still got my weight too far in the back end. And you can probably see in the clips, I'm actually really actively trying to keep the front down. And as a result, it makes the bike wander around. On the XL, I could just sit and spin. It wasn't really a concern. So that would be a deal breaker for me, because let's face it, for someone that's heavy, trying to get up a climb is hard work as it is. And if it's that much harder work, that's not quite the one for me. I'll tell you what, on the steeper stuff, no question. This is less effort. It's physically less effort on the body, because I think I'm more neutral on the bike. I think you'll see in some of the shots on Rich's bike, I'm definitely with a rearward bias, and that puts a lot more load on your legs. Admittedly, your legs are very strong, but it's still about fatigue at the end of the day. If you can balance out a bit more by having a more neutral position, I do think that is more beneficial. But that said, on the flatter stuff, the twisty stuff, the switchbacks, the short bike was like, it just felt much faster and much easier to ride. Now, bearing in mind that I'm firmly in XL territory, like this is the bike that fits me correctly. It's not just a long bike. Rich, on the other hand, though, he's kind of on the borderline. So, like I said earlier, 6 foot, running the size large, he could definitely run an XL in some bikes, but obviously he knows how he rides. So, you know, he's been doing it a long time. But just like some of those EWS athletes, in particular, Richie really told me he actually liked the ride of a size large and did ride on a fair bit at home, but a medium made more sense for racing. It was just that little bit shorter, just helped him out, and he could muscle it through the stuff where the bike would get a bit more disturbed because of the speed. And I guess it's the same for Jack Moir, the same concept. But how Jack Moir, with his saddle that high, can get an efficient climbing position to really sort of not be too fatigued, that does surprise me. I would be interested, though, putting Rich on this bike versus his, if you've got the sag setting the same between the two, on a downer track, something like that, just to see what the difference is in speed. I'm going to ask him and see if he's up for that. But yeah, food for thought about bike sizes. Smaller definitely is. I'd say probably more fun for a lot more people because of the manoeuvrability. This can be a handful unless you've got the terrain for it. I'd love to know what you think. Are you on a big bike camp, or would you prefer a smaller, more agile bike? Let us know in the comments underneath, and we'll see you in another video soon. Take care.